From the land of the long white cloud, we respect our spiritual bond with the land and allow our footsteps to tread with care. From our most northern and southern shores, we welcome you. Haere mai.
Kihe mauri ora.
From the vast plains of the Great Southern Land, we respect and acknowledge our First Nations peoples and their ancestors. We acknowledge them as custodians and knowledge holders of today and for tomorrow. We understand that we are all temporary caretakers of the lands from which we are born and we will return to. We embrace that the spirit of the land, waterways, sea and sky can guide us.
Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon if you are calling in from Australia, which I know some of you are. At least two of our speakers at least are. Three of our speakers are anyway. That was a welcome video from Ventia, but actually we're now going to have an acknowledgement in country from Uncle Paul. And Uncle Paul is a First Nation person of the Warrami people. He supports public and private sector organisations to create specialised training for people around Aboriginal culture and services. Paul, please acknowledge.
Hi everybody, it's my great privilege to do an acknowledgement of country, and I've also been asked to share a little bit from our culture about leadership in the context of social value, given this is a social value conference. So first of all, I wish to acknowledge country wherever you may be right across this world. I'm here in my country in Australia, of course. And to understand what an acknowledgement of country is to understand the Aboriginal perspective of country. So country is our mother. In our stories, the Mother Earth is the most beautiful thing that has ever been and ever will be. And there's a big creation story about how the mother rose from the water and was born. And she met with the father in the sky and they fell in love and she became pregnant and she gave birth to all things. She gave birth to the insects, to the trees, to the kangaroo, to the dolphin, to the birds, to all living things. And last of all, she gave birth to humans. So this is a big story to remind us when we acknowledge country that we're all one with country, that we are not separate. And it's an important part of Aboriginal culture to understand that the mother gives us all that we need. So she gives us our water, she gives us our air, she gives us our food. And without the mother, we have nothing, but also we have the mother's love. And so I acknowledge country wherever we may be and wish to inspire everybody to think about country wherever they may live and to give thanks for the mother because we're all connected by her. Everyone I'm talking to today, you're all my brothers and sisters, as is everything around you in nature, because we are one, we are family. And when we understand that, then we create a better world. And so I give thanks for the mother and hope that we can all think about how we care for mother, which is the segue into what I want to talk about in terms of leadership, just for a couple of moments. To do that, I want you to imagine a world now that's different to the world we've got. I want you to imagine a world where there are no wars, where there are no armies, where there's no need for a police force. I want you to imagine a world where there is no hunger, where there is no poverty. I want you to imagine a world where everyone has all they need to live a wonderful life and they live to 100 years of age. We can all imagine that world, but people will go, well, I can imagine it, but it's not a reality. We have a history of hurting each other. That is not true. In Aboriginal, what is now called Australia, for 60,000 years, we cared for each other, we loved each other, we looked after each other, and we had that life. And so the challenge I want to put before you is if we had this idyllic life for so long, what is it we can learn from that life and transpose it into this contemporary world and create a better world? Because in terms of leadership, leadership is failing us at the moment. And so when I hear about a conference on social values, I go, wow, this is so great to hear the world is finally starting to think about what is really important in terms of leadership. And a way to think about that for each of you individually and with your organisations is another Aboriginal saying, and that is, when we leave this world behind, all we leave behind is our story. So make it the best story possible. So for every one of us, in our culture, we're born for a purpose. We're born in love, we live in love, we go back to love, but we have a purpose. But as we grow, we can get that purpose distorted and we get convinced to an alternative purpose that isn't the right purpose. And so all of us needs to be living a good story. And in our way, we only live a good story by following what we call the law, which is our ways of knowing, being and doing. And when we do that, we live our story, and then everyone lives a good story. And in terms of leadership, in terms of organizations, a leader creates great stories around them. So the question is, if you're in a leadership role, are you creating great stories? I would hope so, because you're invested in a social values conference. But how do we kind of spread that word and get everybody on the same page? That's the big challenge. That is what I'm so passionate about. That is why I'm so blessed and privileged to be sharing with you today an acknowledgement of country, because a leader creates great stories. And I've got a leadership book coming out in March of next year, and it's not a condemnation of Western leadership. It's a challenge to say Western leadership programs focus far too much on the how. How do we lead? Oh, we need to do strategy. We need to communicate. We need to build a rapport. We need inspiration. And they don't think enough about the why. Or if we have a why, it's the wrong why. It's about profitability. It's about productivity. Now, there's nothing wrong with those things, but they need to be housed in something far bigger. And so to do that, I'll just share with you two different definitions of business leadership or leadership. A Western leadership model is to achieve delineated outcomes within specified timeframes with a given budget through people. We all know that. But does that create a greater world? No, it doesn't. This is why you're all so important to me. The Aboriginal definition of leadership that I've created is slightly different, and that is, and it's based on many years with elders, and that is, a leader's role is to fulfill their responsibility to care for their place and all things in their place for their children's children's children. Think about that. All things in their place for their children's 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 children. And so you bring the two together. We need organisations that are sustainable, that are profitable, but in a way that supports a healthy planet, that supports thriving communities, that allows children to grow up with hope and inspiration to care for each other. Because in that big story about creation, we're only well if country is well, we're only well if all people are well. We need to care for each other, because when we hurt anyone, we hurt ourselves. We all need to live, look, and love each other. And so I'll finish with a little story from Aboriginal Australia. Before the white sails come, we had 500 nations, 500 different languages, 500 different ways to dance, 500 different art forms. But underpinning that was the one law, which is I must always care for my place and all things in my place. So right across Australia, it was I must always care for my place and all things in my place. Children were taught that from when they were very little. How can we bring that in? Because that is a big story about diversity is only powerful if we have unity. We know when we look at organisations, we have power hierarchies. We don't have circular leadership at all. We have power. Power creates fear. Fear creates risk, adversity, and we don't go forward. We don't innovate. We don't care for each other because we're frightened within each team about, will we get funded? Will I have my job? So we need unity underpinning the diversity, and then we can create innovation and love and caring and kindness. And that's what true leadership is all about. And in the model I've created in the book that's coming out next year, I talk about responsibility, relationships, respect, recognition, reflection, results, resilience, and renewal. They're the 8 R's of leadership that if we truly embrace social values, we will create a better world for generations we'll never meet in human form. And so that's a message about, we get a bit excited about the quadruple bottom line, but it's been around for 60,000 years. So please, please tap into Indigenous wisdom. I'm so privileged to be with you today. And I wish you all the best with this conference and in future endeavours. And I really do hope that I get to meet some of you face to face in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. It's my name's Aaron Reid. I'm GM for Social Sustainability at Ventia, and it's my absolute privilege to host this session and this panel today. But just want to take a moment to acknowledge Paul and his words. I've been in Australia for not very long, and only 2 years, and the greatest gift that I've had since coming here is the ability to tap into 60,000 years of knowledge and leadership and a perspective that I'd never considered before from where I came from. And it's one of the things I'm proudest of this conversation that we're starting here today, and the conversation that we're going to continue to have, is the opportunity to export that 60,000 years of Indigenous leadership and knowledge as introduced to me through Dr. Paul Callaghan to the rest of the world. It's something that so many people know so little about, and is so desperately needed at this moment. So thank you, Paul, and certainly Paul's perspective that he's outlined today is something that I think is going to be the basis for the conversation that we have today. This session today is being hosted by the Social Value Taskforce from Australia, and we're planning to look at the lessons learnt in developing a TOM system for Australia, and how this could be the first step in developing a wider global approach to support future generations in a way aligned to the thinking outlined by Dr. Paul Callaghan. We've got some big voices and a massive brains trust on this panel today, and I'm definitely excluding myself from that, not least of all because I may be suffering the effects of jet lag, early start, late start. I can't quite work out what time it is, and so I'm very keen to get out of the way and introduce you to some of our panelists today. We're hoping not just to have an interesting conversation that will inspire.
Oh, we've lost everyone. So should we dive into it while we're waiting for excuse me, I'll jump in for everyone. Who had planned to go first and start the conversation while we're waiting for everyone to jump in? I can't remember who.
Tara was going to go first. Is that right, Tara?
Great, I can jump in and just speak for
Yeah.
Aaron. We've got some wild weather going on in Australia today, so perhaps there's some disruption with internet connections.
He has no excuse because he is in the UK. That's
Oh,
the
he is in the UK. Okay,
and I can
take
tell
it
you,
all back.
It's pretty benign here, but he's in an old hotel. His internet is obviously just dropped out, so I can see.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Oh, we've got you now. Back, Aaron.
So sorry. I'll very quickly hand over to our first speaker. Tara, could you introduce yourself and give some context for how social value is currently playing out in Australian procurement and how effective you think the current approach is?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here. And thank you so much, Paul, for that beautiful introduction and just the pride that I feel as an Australian in hearing you speak about the culture of the lands that I have the privilege to live on is really beautiful. So I am the CEO at Social Traders. Social Traders is an industry body for social enterprise and social performance. We've been doing that work in Australia for nearly 20 years. So we focus on two things. One is looking at the social enterprise model, which is essentially how you build purpose into business and do that in a sustainable way. Best way I like to think of social enterprise is it's the business and charity mashed together. So we are here to support them. And a lot of the way that we do that is through activating social performance in business. And social procurement forms a really big part of that work. So we are partnering with some of the biggest businesses around Australia and the state governments here to help them activate their social performance policies and activate social procurement and buy from and partner with social enterprises. And I've spent my career hopping around the for-purpose sector in various different forms into charity and social innovation, social enterprise, peak bodies, and find it a real privilege to land in this intersection where I sit now, which is looking at how do we activate social value within business? Because as Paul outlined, from a leadership perspective, these are the qualities that we need to have in order to enable business to exist the way that Aboriginal communities lived 60,000 years ago, because it works, and because everyone is cared for, and because we do have equal societies when we operate in that way. So our Social Traders has been at the forefront of a lot of this work in Australia, and it's a very quite a different context in Australia than the UK. And I worked in the UK for 7 years, and you've got the great asset there of the Social Value Act. We don't have something similar in Australia, so we're working quite differently. What we've got is patchy policy context across different states, and we have a very state-based system here, which means that the state jurisdictions operate quite independently from the federal jurisdiction, which essentially means we've got 8 different policy contexts that we're working with in the Australian context. What we do have is some really great social procurement policy in Victoria. There's a social procurement framework there, which looks at social enterprises and Indigenous businesses and local businesses and women-owned. And that has set some fantastic targets and mandates that's put pressure on business to start to engage social enterprises in their supply chain. And there's been some excellent results that have come out of that work, but it's patchy. Other states have lighter, looser policy settings in place, and we don't yet have a federal government whole of Australia approach to social procurement or social enterprise procurement. So social value in Australia is much more reliant on individual businesses wanting to do the work. We see 3 different motivations in the Australian context. One is the policy, the stick that I mentioned. It's the tick box of those that are doing it to win a contract or a tender. There's a have to requirement for them. But the other 2 motivations we see in Australia, and it's skewing in this direction now, is the champion within the business who has seen that there's a win-win in here. That yes, we can create amazing social outcomes by working with social enterprise and doing social procurement and activating social value, but also it makes business sense. So we're improving our own bottom line, we're improving our reputation, our competitive advantage, our staff engagement when we do this work. So there's a whole range and an increasing number of businesses and the champions within them that are taking on this mantle and creating great change. And then the third motivation that we see is where there's a real values-driven approach within a business, and it's top-down. So it often comes from either the board or the CEO and the leadership team, where they've made a commitment to say, we want to be a business that does good for the world as well as does our business activity. And we're seeing more and more businesses setting those values, setting ESG strategies and policies or sustainability strategies and policies, and then setting their own social performance targets within that. Ventia is a fantastic example of one of the businesses that's leading the way in this space. And there are lots more in Australia that are now starting to behave in this way and implement and introduce some of these policies. So it's great to see that kicking off, but it is reliant on those champions and those businesses picking up the work and taking it on. And what works really well is where it gets embedded in business practice. And then we see some fantastic examples of businesses not only doing the work themselves to buy from social enterprise and embed social value, but they're activating their supply chain, they're pushing that out to their customers, and they're helping social enterprises to grow because they're partnering with them in really genuine ways to say, if we want to create really great social value and extended social value, it's not just about buying from social enterprises, it's about growing social enterprises so that we can then buy more from them. And we're seeing some businesses really pick up that opportunity to create more social value through growing the sector that they're working with, which is really fantastic to see. And then there's barriers as well, as I mentioned, that unless there's an incentive for the work, it's hard to kickstart it in a business. Unless you've got someone that's got that third motivation, which is a values-led approach to ESG and social value, then it's quite hard to get it going. And so where there isn't some form of incentive, whether that's a policy lever or a strategy lever or a directive within a business, or some of the great work we see is where bonuses get tied to social value creation. That's where you get activity happening. But where there aren't those kind of incentives in place, then it's often hard to get a business engaged, particularly when we're operating in the current global economy that we live in, where it's not only a challenging economy, but there is, a narrative out there that's questioning social value from lots of different perspectives. So that just makes it a little harder to engage people with it and to take that step in and that leap to do the work when there's been questions raised about it. Having said that, we have those champions all over the country and Australia doing this work in really fantastic ways. And we're at the start of a journey here. So that's why we're really excited to be working with Social Value Portal and a part of the Social Value Taskforce that Aaron mentioned, because there's a huge opportunity to grow the work in Australia. We are at the very starting point. There's been fantastic work done over the last kind of 8 years in particular, and so much more to do. And having social value measurements and metrics in place and an ability to actually quantify it, make it visible, talk about it, then build the awareness to grow it is the next step for the Australian market. So we're really looking forward to seeing what we can do in the Australian context.
Thank you, Tara. That incentives point I think is really important. I wanted to take a moment just to acknowledge the Social Value Task Force that we talked about. It's a collective of kind of 80 odd public, private, voluntary sector organisations who all have a common interest in developing a common and consistent way to measure social value, but I think more importantly, a way of not just proving what we do, but improving what we do, and using the awesome power of procurement and public procurement in particular to incentivize those people in the supply chain to compete on delivering more good. And the job of turning those good intentions into something practical, tangible, and useful for us all was one that Nathan Goode, somebody who hopefully most of you will be aware of, is the big brains that sits alongside other big brains at Social Value Portal to do all the hard work behind the scenes to make it look so simple for us to engage with. And I wonder, Nathan, if you could just introduce yourself and reflect on your role in developing the Australian TOMs, and what was different about the approaches in the UK to what you found in Australia.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aaron. It's a huge privilege to be here this morning, and Paul, thank you for your wonderful introduction. I don't know about big brains, but I'm Nathan Goode, Chief Knowledge Officer at Social Value Portal, and I look after everything to do with how we think about social value and how we put it into practice. And at the heart of that is our TOM system, which is the way in which we measure and report on social value. And as I speak, I'm very conscious of Paul's point about the how and the why, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So it's an enormous privilege for me to be able to guide the team at Social Value Portal that actually develops and expands the TOM system, and this year a very significant part of the work that they've been doing has been to take on the challenge of developing something for Australia. Aaron's just asked me to talk about my role. Let me just say, I'm not going to say too much about it, but I'm not claiming the hard grind on this. So I have a team of researchers who put in a huge amount of time to develop that, and I'd also like to say that the insight and support and wisdom provided by the Australian Social Value Taskforce has made this a very rewarding and rich process, and something which is ongoing, is continuing, and I think the point we need to make is that this is not a thing that lands in a final form. It will continue to evolve and develop, and it's a starting point for a conversation. I think, yes, as Tara says, it provides metrics and numbers and a framework, and as I say, it offers a possible how, but as I say, it's a starting point. It's the beginning of a journey, I think. So just in terms of differences and similarities between the way we approach the development of the TOM system in the UK compared with Australia, in some ways, I mean, let me just speak for a moment about the similarities. In both cases, we started with a task force, and interestingly, actually, I was looking back to see how long it took us to get from the beginning of that task force in the UK to a final launch of a TOM system in the UK, about 18 months. So we've we've overrun by 6 months in Australia, so we're about 2 years in. I think November 2023 was the beginning of the Australian Social Value Taskforce. So it's been a relatively slow and careful process, and as I say, one which is ongoing at the moment. Another similarity really is the broad scope of social value in very, very general terms. That sort of holistic look at social, environmental and economic factors is comparable. I think the main differences, to Tara's point, are about context. As Tara said, social value is not a new concept in Australia. So specifically for the TOM system, it's about figuring out whether this approach, this way of talking about and thinking about social value, actually adds something to what's already there in Australia. And part of the discussions have been about how we position this and make sure that it is additional in its own right to what's happening already. The second important point is around geography. The sheer size of Australia, the huge differences in population density across the country have completely reshaped the way in which we think about social value in connection with place and the social value opportunities that are created as a result of that. So you'll see that when the Australian TOM system is launched. But I think most importantly, the third main area is recognizing and acknowledging and taking account of the longest established culture and civilization in Australia, and the TOM system for Australia therefore specifically takes account or makes provision for social value in the context of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as a separate and distinct leg, if you like, to TOM system. So those are the main differences. Aaron, can I hand back to you? Have we lost Aaron?
I think we've lost Aaron, but good news is I got a spidey sense that I think I was next up, so I'm happy to jump in. And
okay, cool.
You've shared so many powerful reflections, I think, about what's possible in Australia, what's currently happening, and it becomes a conversation about feasibility versus desirability and what is the status of the current conversation. I think it's important to say that I come into this conversation quite biased. I'm currently here on Ngunnawal country in Canberra for the Wellbeing Forum, so I was just presenting all on this content at the forum yesterday. And what I can say is I started banging this drum in our federal parliament 5 years ago, and people looked at me like I was an alien. We need to think about future generations. We need intergenerational thinking in policy. I can tell you the responses I got back then versus now are radically different. What has evolved over the last few years is that there is genuine and deep, profound interest in this work in the public sector, in the private sector, and in the social sector. Over the last few years, we've been convening the Parliamentary Group for Future Generations, so bringing together MPs and senators to discuss what's possible for embedding this into legislation. We've also been bringing together the Intergenerational Fairness Coalition, so civil society organisations looking to champion and support this work. And I'm delighted to say there's plenty of private sector organisations that we're also speaking with. But the challenge here is that everyone is thinking of how can we experiment internally, but they don't quite feel ready to share those experiments publicly. Because, and I understand a lot of people are nervous to try something innovative, to be some of the first to step out and do it wrong, or to be accused of whatever the future gen's equivalent of greenwashing is. But my invitation to everyone on this call is to see the opportunity to embed this in such a robust system of measurement and of progress, and see how we can collectively stride into this space that is both needed and deeply feasible, and exactly as Tara said at the beginning, provides a win-win opportunity. If you look at the attraction, retention, and advancement of employees, if you look at the engagement of potential customers, stakeholders, there's so much benefit to be had for an organization by striding into this space. Back to you, Aaron, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you. And apologies, I think I dropped out somewhere in between there. And thank you for introducing yourself, Taylor. Sophie, if I can, it seems we may have lost Sophie. Sophie, are you there? The wonders of modern technology. While Sophie is hopefully reconnecting, I think Sophie's back. But while Sophie's reconnecting, the context for me is this might be a desirable thing to do. It might be a thing which is supported in Australia, and there is a context for it. But I'm really keen to have a conversation with Sophie about lessons learned, and has this ever been done before, and are there any lessons for a potential new Australian and global standard? I'm hoping that my waffle has given Sophie enough time to have reconnected, and she is there. If not, I might have another question for Nathan. Sophie, are you there? Were you able to join?
Yeah, I'm here, and hopefully you can hear me. Apologies about my internet connection. I don't know if you're also in London, Aaron, but London seems to be experiencing some Wi-Fi issues this morning. So I'm Sophie Howe. I suppose I'm best known as being the first Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. And for those of you who don't know, Wales was the first country in the world to legislate to protect the interests of future generations, and to embed well-being goals in everything that we do. So Tara was talking about a kind of a bit of a hodgepodge of different sort of policies at different levels, and so on. And essentially our Future Generations Act in Wales tried to address that by saying, here are 7 wellbeing goals that every institution in Wales, from the government right down to our local councils and all of our institutions in between, need to be delivering against. So I suppose in a way that formed the kind of holistic approach to how we move towards social value in Wales. It also embeds this concept of intergenerational fairness, so testing all of our decisions as to whether they meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that's why it's so brilliant to start the session with Uncle Paul, because actually it's, this I say we were the first country to legislate for future generations. This isn't global north thinking. This is thinking that has come from Indigenous cultures, where 7th generation thinking, how do our decisions today play out for multiple generations, is actually sort of embedded in the way that Indigenous cultures work. It's something that we have lost, in the way that we do business at the moment, and it's something that through the approach that we're taking in Wales, we are trying to regain. And also, Uncle Paul talked about sort of creating our stories. And I suppose in Wales, what we were attempting to do was to recreate our stories. So just a little bit of context about Wales, in that, we were at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution. The first £1 million cheque for coal was signed in the coal exchange in our capital city. But actually, as coal depleted, we encountered many job losses, huge amounts of intergenerational poverty, health challenges, and so on that came from that. And part of what developing our Future Generations Act in 2014 and 15 was about recreating this story. What is the Wales that we want to leave behind for future generations, and how do we make sure that all of the decisions that we take stack up to actually achieving that vision? And that vision was co-created with citizens in Wales through a national conversation. And it was that national conversation that led to the creation of these 7 wellbeing goals, which is the North Star for all of our decisions in Wales. So how does that relate back to social values and the TOMS framework? Well, we've been fortunate to work with the Social Value Portal to develop that TOMS framework in Wales, very much based around delivering our 7 wellbeing goals and delivering this principle of intergenerational fairness. There are also 5 principles or decision-making tools that we utilise, which are how have we considered the long-term impact of the things that we do? How do we seek to prevent problems from occurring or getting worse? How do we integrate our actions? So this is recognising that we can't just look at each element of social value in isolation. So because everything's connected to everything, we must look at the ways that we can intersect our decisions and hopefully maximize the impact of our decisions by being connected? How can we collaborate with each other across the public, private, voluntary sector? And how can we involve citizens? So those, I think, are kind of sensible decision-making principles, which we've embedded in the way that we do social value work in Wales. But as many people have said, having the frameworks and the toolkits and the metrics and so on are really important in this, because you need to have a way of measuring what you're achieving. But actually, much of this is about people, and I talk a lot about there being, in many organisations, and mostly I worked in the Future Generations Act with the public sector, but it's equally applicable to the private sector. In those organisations, there are many what I call frustrated champions. So these are people who I think can see or have seen for a long time that there's a better way of doing things, but the system almost frustrates them from doing that. The system is endemically short-term. We have short-term budget cycles. A lot of our policy frameworks are based on short-term electoral cycles. And the system is not joined up. So the system is about how do we do the right things in our department, rather than looking collectively and holistically around how we might spend better across multiple departments, agencies, policy areas, and so on. And those frustrated champions, when we give them a tool, and in our case in Wales, we gave them a law that they could wave at the people who were saying, no, I only want to do that if it's going to deliver a return on my investment in this financial year, rather than over multiple years, or we're only going to do that if we can justify that within my budget line rather than multiple budget lines. And when you give those frustrated champions a tool which enables them to challenge that system, they very much do that. And one of the first things that happened in Wales was a woman who was the head of procurement in public health Wales, and the proposition that she put, they were moving to new offices, and the proposition that she put is, we are Public Health Wales. Our raison d'etre is to improve the health of the nation. So we need to show in every way that we are commissioning and procuring the things that we need to procure for this office, that we're doing that. And she had a real battle on that. But what ended up happening is that the hundreds and hundreds of desks and office equipment which came from their multiple other offices weren't sent to landfill, were instead repurposed with a social enterprise and recycled. And we ended up saving, thousands of tons of waste from landfill and actually supporting a social enterprise. The carpet and flooring that was commissioned was again purchased from a social enterprise whose profits go into providing carpets for the lowest income families in Wales. I could go on in terms of the way in which Sally, the procurement lead there, was really driving through every point this connection back to what is the raison d'etre of Public Health Wales, and how can we show that when we're not just delivering our services, but we're spending our money, that we are meeting that raison d'etre through the Future Generations Act as well. Now, just very briefly in terms of what's happening across the globe. Well, last year, around about this same time last year, the United Nations passed the world's first declaration on future generations. And what that declaration requires all member states to do is to put in place arrangements in the development, assessment, evaluation and implementation of all policies, arrangements to protect the interests of future generations. So if we take that to the letter of what that declaration says, that basically says that every country should be applying something along the lines of what I've just described in a future generations context, and in every aspect of their decision making. And this is where I think it gets really exciting in terms of what social value and what the toolkits and the TOMS framework in Australia can bring, because it does bring that framework to enable organisations, whether they're public, private, or third sector, to actually start to meet those aspirations. I guess what we want to see in Australia is, I would say, first of all, a Future Generations Bill, and shout out to Taylor and Foundations for Tomorrow and the very many brilliant organisations that they work with on the work that's being done there. We are hopeful of seeing some similar things perhaps roll out in some of the states. I've been doing a lot of work in Western Australia, so watch this space in terms of how we might see movements on future generations there. And once we have that framework, I think that will really turbocharge the ability of TOMs and social value to roll out not just to the champions and not just to those who are doing it because they want to win work, but actually will be a core requirement in everything that we all do.
Thank you, Sophie. It's when I first kind of heard about the Future Generations Act in Wales, it was the absolute most no-brainer piece of legislation that I thought I'd ever heard. I just couldn't believe that everywhere hadn't already required all public policy to have consideration for future generations. It seems insane to me to have it any other way. Colleagues, I'm mindful we're moving towards the kind of Q&A section of this panel discussion. Please do take the opportunity to ask any questions, any difficult questions, easy questions, or anything you'd like further clarification on in the chat, and I'll find a way to find the right person to answer them. Before I do, though, Nathan, obviously we've heard the discussion today. It's obviously a desirable thing to do. It seems to be possible. It has the support and the momentum from stakeholders within Australia and elsewhere, and happens to be based on principles that are founded in 60,000 years of knowledge from one of the world's oldest continuous cultures. But can you translate that into a workable standard for Australia and potentially the basis for a global standard? I'm very mindful. A good friend of mine often says, when all is said and done, much more is said than done. And, we're doing a lot of talking here, but it's going to come down to the doing that you and your team do to translate it into something workable. I'm hoping the answer is yes, Aaron, too easy, no problem. What's your thought, Nathan?
Yeah, well, there we go. We can move straight on to the Q&A then, can't we? So, so yes, we love a challenge, and I guess so. So just picking up on what Sophie was saying, one of the really nice things for us is that we're now on our second iteration of developing the TOMs to align with the Future Generations Act in Wales, and the learning from the work we've done with the Australia TOMs is feeding straight into that second iteration of the TOM system for Wales. And under the bonnet, a lot of work is going on to kind of think about impact, think about longer term effects of the kind of activities that are signposted by something like the TOM system. I guess, having said that, because I'm a kind of cautious person by nature, I kind of feel I need to sort of put one caveat down, which is that the TOM system is very much embedded in a kind of present way of thinking, and our kind of core role, I think, is to act as a kind of interface between business and other organisations, but very much with business front of mind, and enable them to engage in this agenda and to deliver social value and social impact, and think about the wider and longer term effects of how they function as organisations. So to do that, we need to be able to make the business case for social value in a business context. So in a way, we sort of have one foot in the present and one foot in the future, and it's about how do we evolve this process whilst retaining that relevance to kind of immediate business concerns as well, so that people can see the connection between where they are now as a business, where they are now as an organisation, and where they want to be and what their legacy should be for not just this generation, but future generations as well. So that's very much, as I said at the beginning, very much a journey. It's an evolutionary process and something where, as I say, it's great to be able to come back to the TOM system for Wales and look at it again and go, actually, we can move this along now. We can make it more impactful and more connected with those longer term effects. But creating the context for that way of thinking is crucial to this. So the short answer is yes. I think we can do it if we work together in the way that we're working with task forces and governments and those kind of wider frameworks sit around it. Because at the end of the day, the TOMS is just a tool. It's just a mechanism for getting things done.
Excellent. Thank you, Nathan. And we've got a few questions coming through now. I'm just trying to work out which order to put them in, but probably the first question is right back at you, Nathan, which is great. You've just agreed you can do this. When will you do this? No. The question is, when is the Australian TOM system going to be made available to people? Is there a timeline we have on that? I know it's imminent. How imminent is it going to be in terms of public availability to review that standard?
Well, we are working with the Social Value Taskforce for Australia, as you said up front. So the key decision point at that is obviously for the task force to be comfortable with what we're producing. And as you know, we're in that sort of engagement consultation process at the moment. I can't remember the exact date of the next scheduled task force meeting. I think it's next month, I believe, and we're aiming for that to be for the work to be completed by then, and hopefully we'll get the green light to go public with this after that. So I would say end of this year, beginning of next, but hopefully before Christmas.
Wonderful, marvelous. We've got another question here that I think if I can pull Paul and Taylor into answering this one, and please don't ask me why I've chosen you two as representing different ends of the perspective on this question. But the question is, if you could describe the importance of this to older generations that don't agree, in a few words, what would those words be? And I think, Taylor, you're representing the voice of young people.
Taylor?
Sorry, go on. You go, Paul.
I'll go first, and it's kind of related to the question, but it's a bit broader than that. And I've been very inspired by all the conversations, by the way, and I want to build on what Taylor said about incentivize. And it brought into my mind the whole sticks versus carrots thing. So I know I used to lead a big organisation. I had 1,200 staff, and some people really like the carrot. Other people, you do need to use the stick, which is the policy. But I can't help but think this is really an education piece, and this question captures it. It's not so much about the politicians, because I don't trust them at all, never will. I used to be a director general and I reported to one. This is about getting the critical mass of the population, and we know the younger population will listen, and this is a great question, getting the older generation. So it's about education, but also tapping into what Nathan said about the business case. And this isn't a critique of Nathan, but it's a critique of how we think. We always think we need to put the business case, and from an Aboriginal perspective, we're taught to never use our head to make decisions at all because we get brainwashed. And so I'm suggesting, instead of the head case, which is the business case, what about the humanity case? What about the emotional connection? Because when we look at the planet right now, when you look at the atomic clock from the Bureau of Nuclear Scientists, they say we're at crisis point, the closest point of annihilation ever in the history of humankind. Where do we get the emotional connection through education to people that we really need to take this seriously, because we have an obligation and responsibility to future generations to fix up the mess that we've created, and to really create that emotional spirit connect where people want to join this. And so how do we get the older generations to do that? As a grandparent, I would say connect with me about my grandchildren, because I'd say, hell yeah, I want my grandchildren to grow up thinking, gee, I'm thankful for what was left behind for me. In traditional Aboriginal society, our people would join two branches of a small tree together, knowing it would take 200 years to become a big story and a site. And now we take young people to that site to teach young people to respect women and motherhood. Now that site was created with people knowing, oh, I won't be alive when this happens. We need to create this future mindset. And I think for older people, it's about, think about those that you love that are younger people. I'll hand over to Taylor.
Thank you so much, Paul. And I think, number one, I've been very fortunate to read the book that's coming out next year, and I would highly recommend everyone jump on that as quickly as you can. If you have resonated with anything said today, it's one of the most fantastic invitations to what I think the future of leadership needs to be that I have seen. I realize amongst all the tech kerfuffle, I didn't properly give context to myself, which is my background is actually in leadership development consulting and cultural change in organizations, working with Salesforce, Google, Cyro, and I started Foundations for Tomorrow about 4.5, 5 years ago, because I realized the absolute absence of intergenerational thinking in policy. It's a long story of how that ended up happening, but I think that gives good context, which is I absolutely echo what Paul has said, which is on the level of our humanity, we absolutely need to be making the cultural and mindset changes that bake this into how we operate as humans, and looking at that support, incentives, and accountability for how we can surround people with an ecosystem that supports this. And I think while we're getting everyone along on that journey, the zoomed in argument that I find often works is, for the first time, we have 7 generations actively operating in the workplace, which is one of the most effective arguments that I have found, getting whether it is executives or maybe slightly resistant individuals on board with the need for intergenerational literacy, even to be able to collaborate in a team. And so us nourishing and investing in our intergenerational compact is essential to make that work, because otherwise we'll continue falling in the traps of intergenerational warfare. Workplaces will continue to struggle to maintain intergenerational teams. And that is then going to become, a performance issue in all of the ways that many people resistant to this idea like to measure. So I absolutely echo what Paul has said, which is where I want us to head and where I think this conversation should live and stay, is in that mindset, cultural, in our way of being. And while you're trying to bring people to the place that they can hear and be receptive to that conversation, it's the practical realities of the shape of our workforce now, and the metrics that within the current system people are held accountable to, it also translates into that system.
Thank you, Taylor. Thank you, Paul. We had another question come in. I'll probably just take one or two more questions, and I'll try and grab a final thought. But this question is around: do you think it will be possible to, and if I pose it to Sophie in the first instance, do you think it will be possible to get the United Nations to pass a future generations resolution? Although, as we know from the climate summits, passing the act is hard enough, then getting governments to do anything is another level. Before you jump in, just a word to say, what's interesting in the Australian experience is that we haven't waited for government. Businesses, third sector organisations, and some public organisations have just decided that we want to do this for these reasons, and we haven't waited for kind of government. It's interesting now that we're starting to engage with government, but they're playing catch up with what we have decided as a collective that we want to do. So yes, Sophie, in that context, could you have a crack at that one?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the good news is that they have passed a Future Generations declaration, which the vast majority of member states were supportive of. I probably don't need to tell you the states who opposed it. You could probably have a reasonable guess at that. But that does provide us with a kind of a useful framework, and that framework is both for countries, for member states, and also for reforms in the UN itself. But as Fiona rightly points out, passing a declaration or resolution is, just the sort of starting point in a way, and it's then the actual implementation of that. And that implementation, from the work that I've been doing with the School of International Futures, and if you want to have a look, we've just published a policy handbook on how member states can implement the declaration. We're working with Taylor and a number of other colleagues in terms of trying to advance this work in Australia, in Cameroon, in Kenya, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Finland, Norway. There's lots going on in the domestic settings. How that is actually implemented in those domestic settings, though, can be quite challenging. And I think with some of this stuff, there's a real risk that we kind of pay lip service to it. What I see in different countries is that there are many countries who've implemented wellbeing frameworks. There's many countries who've got foresight units in government that churn out reports which land on politicians' desks and aren't necessarily acted upon. The best way that we can advance this is if you think about a kind of triangle of action. We need citizens, civil society, academia, NGOs involved in really pushing for something like this. We need to find those political champions, and that's the work Taylor has been involved in with the parliamentary group, and we need to build a greater number of political champions across parties. And then we need to work within the system, so within the kind of machinery of government and the machinery of our private sector organisations, finding those frustrated champions, getting those different toolkits and new approaches implemented. And where you bring those three things together, the citizen pressure, if you like, the system being ready to respond, and the politics requiring different things and new things and future generations and sort of social value thinking, then that's when you start to see that movement, which is why I think it's so important that, I can see that there are almost 150 people in this session, I imagine representing social enterprises, private sector organisations, probably public sector organisations as well. It's why it's so important that we're looking at how do we kind of collaborate together, learn, share, but also put pressure on the system as a whole to be moving this forward.
Thank you, Sophie. We've got just a couple of minutes left. If I can take chair's privilege and just direct a couple of my own questions. Tara, if I can ask one of you to answer briefly, and that's what is, you obviously work in public organisations helping procurement teams to integrate social considerations in their procurement process, and the other perspective that you have. What do you think is the hardest truth we need to face if we're serious about building systems that truly serve future generations? And I appreciate that question wasn't originally intended for you, but I suspect you can answer.
If I could solve that one, Aaron, then we'd all be miles ahead of where we are today. I think the hardest truth, and the thing that I lament, is that despite all of the conversation that we've had and a lot of the people that are here and engaging with this topic, fundamentally businesses are led by self-interest in the current economy. And if we don't accept that, as opposing as that feels to the people that are in this community with us, we're never going to be able to make that case and to get that momentum and to change the minds. And this is human work, is the other truth that comes out to me all the time. This is change management. And if we don't engage with people as humans and make it personal to them, then we're never going to get that step change that we need to create. And that's the challenge on all of us that are trying to shift this system. We have to engage with people where they are, with what matters to them, and we have to make it personal. And that's where capturing social value and being able to tell the stories behind it is incredibly powerful. Because if you can connect that to a person's lived experience and own sets of values and own interests, then we can shift the dial.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tara, and thank you to everybody. We are rapidly approaching the end of our time together today. I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank all of our panelists and all of you for getting up at this ungodly hour to listen to us talking about this very important subject. Colleagues, you know the impacts that the TOMS framework has had in the UK. Imagine a world where we have a globally consistent framework that incentivizes, encourages and provides a methodology for organizations everywhere to deliver outcomes that benefit local communities. It's overwhelming to think about, but is the thing that I would like you to think about as we start to have this very practical conversation about exactly how we do develop this global standard. I'd encourage you to lean in to that conversation and to have your voice heard and reflected in that conversation as part of the Global Social Value Task Force. I'd also ask you to lean in and understand more about Aboriginal culture, Aboriginal leadership, and Aboriginal knowledge that we have the absolute gift of in Australia. 60,000 years of continuous culture and knowledge is something not to be sniffed at. And I think you've already understood from the conversation we've had today at the different perspective that can bring to your own thinking. And so a great and very respectful thank you to Dr. Paul Callaghan for sharing his thoughts with us today. And I look forward to getting my own copy of that book. Thank you very much for being here. I look forward to seeing some of you in the flesh soon and some of you online even sooner. Take care.
Yeah,
all the best.
And just to
Thank you
jump
very
in
much.
very quick, thanks everybody. We're on at 9 o'clock for everyone who wants to continue, and then we've got a whole day of events. At 9 o'clock, we've got a fantastic panel looking at social value and business. So please join us. But can I just thank Aaron for doing the most amazing job at sharing this session and bringing out some fantastic insights. And I'm really looking forward to what comes out of this conversation for future generations. Children. It's 3 layers. And Taylor, I've got to ask, not now, but later, 7 generations in the workplace? That is, I'm trying to calculate it out, what it looks like, but I'll ask you later. Thanks everybody so much for doing that. Really fantastic opening session. Goodbye and see you in 10, 12 minutes.